Okay, I think we'll start. Let me remind you what we were doing last time. So I stated theorem 18, which was saying the following. So we consider an arbitrary infinite volume Gibbs state for the two-dimensional XY model. At inverse temperature beta, at beta. Then the statement was that for any epsilon positive, there exists some value beta 0 of epsilon, such that for any beta larger than this value, the correlation S0, Sk, beta, this decays like k to the power minus 1 minus epsilon over 2 pi beta. Okay. So today I want to prove this result. So let's start with the proof. So last week I gave you some heuristic on how we could hope to derive this result by analogy with the corresponding computation for the Gaussian free field. So let me try to implement this idea. So okay, let's start. So we want to. So my goal is to get this estimate for an infinite volume Gibbs state, but the infinite volume Gibbs state can be obtained by definition as a limit of finite volume expectation. So let me fix some box Bn. Let us consider some box Bn with n large. Remember, it's always the usual box minus n to the d, n large. Okay. And some boundary condition, eta, arbitrary boundary condition. Arbitrary. And what I want to prove is an analog of this estimate for the finite volume measure, finite volume Gibbs state in the box Bn with boundary condition eta, and I want the estimate to be uniform in eta so that I can then take the limit. So, so let's do this. So I want to consider S0, Sk in Bn. I will not write beta anymore. It's always the same. I fix beta once and for all in this proof. I want to get an upper bound on this quantity with boundary condition eta. Okay. So then this, by definition, this is the same as the cosine definition of this angle theta, which I introduced last time, of theta k minus theta naught. Again, eta Bn. And this is certainly smaller than the modulus of this quantity. Well, you just write this as the cosine plus I times the sine, and then the modulus of the real number is always larger than the absolute value of its real part. So that's certainly a valid inequality. And then this I can write explicitly. Let me write it here. So this is equal to the integral over d. Let me write it like that, d theta Bn. So this notation here, d theta Bn, is just a shorthand notation for integral from minus pi to pi, integral from minus pi to pi of the product over I in Bn d theta I. Right? Don't want to write that many times, so we'll just use this notation. And then we get E, okay, some partition function. Let me put it here, 1 over z Bn eta, and then ei theta k minus theta naught, say, let's write it explicitly, so this will be minus beta, or plus beta, sum over all ij in the edges of the box Bn of cosine, because we're only looking at the xy model, so the Hamiltonian is just the cosine of theta j minus theta. Okay. And then they get the modulus of all these. So that's the quantity we want to control. It's this integral that we want to upper bound, okay, by some function of k, like that. Okay. So what we are going to do, if you remember the heuristic argument I introduced last week, I was saying that when we wanted to compute the corresponding quantity, I mean this quantity, but not under the xy model, but under the Gaussian free field, interpreting these two variables as the corresponding values for the Gaussian free field, then the way you did that was by shifting the contour of integration from the real line to a translate of the real line by some imaginary number, so I'm translating the variables by some imaginary quantity, and I want to do the same thing here. So let's fix some function, which I will denote by r, the function from ZD, say, well, to r, okay, which is 0 outside the box Bn. Okay. And then what I want to do is for each of the variable theta I, which is in each of the variable theta I with I in Bn, all those contributing to this integral, I want to consider the shift which sends theta I to theta I plus I times Ri. Okay, so I'm adding some imaginary part to the angle theta I do that for all I in Bn. You could do that for all I in ZD, it doesn't change anything because Ri is 0 outside Bn, one way or another. So that's what I want to do. Okay. So for each of these variables, I will do it one variable at a time, but for each of these variables, I'm actually integrating from minus pi to pi in this integral. For each variable, the integration is over minus pi to pi, and I want to translate that, so that's for theta I. I want to translate that from the real line to the real line plus I Ri in this way. So that's, I don't know if you see, sorry. That's the original integration path, and then I want to consider the following closed path. So I want to integrate over this path, right? Now the integrand for each variable theta, the integrand is just an analytic function, so the integral over this closed path has to be equal to 0. By periodicity, the contribution of this vertical path, piece of the path, and this vertical piece of the path, they cancel, because they are equal but opposite, I mean equal but going in the opposite direction. So these cancel by periodicity of the integrand, cancel by periodicity. Okay. And since the integral over the path is 0, that means that the integral over this path is equal to the integral over this path in the same direction. So I can really replace my variable theta I by this variable theta I plus I Ri. And this does not change the value of the integral. Okay? So, Cauchy theorem implies that the value of the integral is unchanged. Is left unchanged. And therefore, we get the following result, that S0 Sk in Bn, it's actually smaller than, so always the boundary condition. And then we have the integral over this d theta Bn. But now I will have, so this theta k minus theta 0, let me do it like that, theta k minus theta 0 plus I rk minus I r0, and then all this times the Hamiltonian, which is beta, sum over all ij eb and b of cosine of theta j minus theta I plus I rj minus I ri. Okay, and then modulus. Okay, I've just shifted all my variables inside the box by an amount, an imaginary amount, ri. Okay. So let's see what happens. So I want an upper bound. So the first natural thing to do now is to bring the modulus inside the integral. So if I do that, okay, if I do that, there are two types of terms that I will get. Let me write them here. So the first, I will get the modulus of this. So, but the modulus of E I theta k minus theta naught plus I rk minus I r naught. Well, once you develop the product here, what you get is something which is real, which is E minus rk plus r naught, and then something which is just exponential of I times some real number, which has modulus 1. So this is just E minus rk minus r naught. Okay. And then for the second term, which is here, the modulus of the second term, E beta sum always over the same thing, I will not write it, cosine theta j minus theta I plus I rj minus I ri. You use one of the standard formula for the cosine of a sum, okay? And then what you get is the following. So this is equal to E beta. This will be cos of theta j minus theta I for cosh of rj minus ri. Okay. Then, of course, you should also get a part with sine, but this one will have an I in front, and therefore the modulus will be 1. So the only thing that remains when I compute the modulus is this quantity. So now, using these two identities, I can upper bound this by bringing the modulus inside, and I get, maybe I will write it here. This implies that, again, 0 is k, theta Bn, this is smaller than 1 over the partition function integral d theta Bn. And then when I bring all this inside, I get one factor, which is this E minus rk minus r naught. This does not depend on the integration variable theta, so I can bring it out. So this is E minus rk minus r naught. And then inside I have this exponential of beta sum over all these ij's. Okay, same thing as before. I will write it like that. Cosh rj minus ri cos, maybe with some space, cos theta j minus theta I. Okay. That's the upper bound I get by applying these two identities there. Okay. And now what I want to do is pretty simple. You see that this, forget about this factor here. Just look at that. This looks very much like the expectation of something under the original Gibbs measure. I have the partition function, I have something which looks like what I want, except that I don't have the Boltzmann weight that I'm looking that I need to interpret this as an expectation. So I would very much like to add here, say, I will do it here. I would be very happy to, if I could add E minus H Bn here, because if I did that, then I could interpret all this expression as the expectation of this quantity under the Gibbs measure. But if I do that, I have to compensate by some factor of the form exponential of plus the Hamiltonian. So if you remember, the Hamiltonian is just the sum, means beta times the sum of the cosine. So it's exactly beta times the sum of the cosine. So if I want to compensate, I just have to put a minus 1 here. Okay, let me do it in blue, like that, minus 1. Right, so this compensates this, and then I have just an identity. It doesn't change anything. But it allows me to reinterpret this whole expression in terms, as an expectation, as the expectation of this function under the original Gibbs measure. So this is equal, just an identity, E minus Rk minus R naught. And then I have the expectation of this function, E beta, usual sum of cosh Rj minus Ri minus 1 times cosine theta j minus theta I. And this is under this measure. Right? I haven't done much, just interpret it in this way. Now, what do I gain by doing that? Well, what I gain is this. Just look at the function that I have here. This quantity, which is here, it's always larger or equal 0, because the cosh, this is a real number, so the cosh is always larger than 1, larger or equal 1, and the cosine here is always smaller or equal 1. Okay? So I can bound this quantity, which is here. This is always smaller than E beta sum of cosh Rj minus Ri minus 1. Right? That's pretty good, because this quantity here, it does not depend on the integration variable theta. It does not depend on the spins of the configuration, just a constant, just a deterministic function. It depends on the R, but the R are just some fixed function that I will optimize over later on. So it's just a fixed function, so I can just take it out of the expectation. The expectation gives me 1. So this is just bounded above by E minus Rk minus R0 plus beta sum. Let me write it explicitly now, because it's the final expression of cosh Rj minus Ri minus 1. Okay, we check that I have all the signs correct, but I think it's fine. It seems okay. Okay, so you get this bound, and now it's just a deterministic upper bound. So if we are lucky enough, it's possible to choose R in such a way that plugging the right function R inside this expression gives me the upper bound I want on this quantity. Okay, it's just a matter of optimizing now over the function R, hoping that it's good enough, that we have not lost too much by these inequalities that we've made. Okay. So let's see, we want to optimize over this. Problem is that finding the best possible R when you have the cosh in the expression, it's a mess. So I will slightly simplify this upper bound before trying to optimize over R. Let me maybe explain this here. So I claim that we'll choose, when we will choose this function R, the optimal R that we will take will satisfy the following property. So we'll choose, we'll have to check that this is indeed true in the end, but we'll choose R such that Ri minus Rj, this is bounded by C over beta, so there exists some C, such that Ri minus Rj is bounded by C over beta for all ij which are neighbors. So say all ij edges in the box. Okay? So if this is true, that means that if I take beta large enough, I can make this gradient between Ri and Rj as small as I want, and then the cosh of Rj minus Ri should be very well approximated by the first few terms of the Taylor expansion. Okay. So that's what I want to do. So now fix some epsilon, positive. That will be the epsilon which appears in the claim, essentially. Then there exists beta 0 of epsilon, such that for any beta larger than beta 0 of epsilon, I can write cosh of Rj minus Ri minus 1, because that's the quantity which appears here. This will be smaller than 1 plus epsilon over 2 Rj minus Ri square. Okay? For all ij in EBM. Okay? I'm just Taylor expanding to second order. I pay a little bit to get an upper bound by putting this epsilon. This will be true as long as Rj minus Ri is small, but this will be automatically satisfied for the R I'm interested in, because I will have this inequality, and this upper bound is as small as I want when beta is large. Okay? So certainly I will be able to get that. And if I do that, then I can just plug it here, and what I get is that this expression, say, the one which is interesting to us, this beta sum over ij in EBN B cosh Rj minus Ri minus 1. This will be smaller than, let me call it beta prime. Beta prime is just 1 plus epsilon beta. Okay. Beta prime times the sum, there is a 1/2 sum over all ij in EBN B, and then this is replaced just by Rj minus Ri square. Okay. But then you recognize here this sum, which is here with the 1/2. This is just the Dirichlet energy associated to R, the same way we had it in the Mermin-Wagner proof. Right? So this is equal to beta prime times the Dirichlet energy of R. Okay. So now the situation is rather simple. As what we have proved is that S0 Sk, this quantity is always smaller than E minus some functional D of R, with D of R, which is just given by Rk minus R0 minus beta prime times the Dirichlet energy of R. So what we have now to optimize over is this quantity. We want to make D of R as large as possible to get a small upper bound. So we want to maximize D of R. Okay, that's our next task, optimizing over R. So that's lemma 819. So if we fix this k, now I want to optimize over R, given this k. Okay. The functional d, which is given here, possesses a single maximum, a single or unique maximizer among all functions R from ZD to R, which are such that Ri is equal to 0 for all I not in the box, which are the ones I'm interested in. Okay. First, the maximizer is unique. It is the only function which satisfies some equation that I'm going to write. It is the only solution to the following equation. So we want to have Laplacian of R at I. So let me be careful with the sign. This is the indicator that I is equal to 0 minus the indicator that I is equal to k divided by 4 beta prime. No, just beta prime. The 4 comes afterwards. Divided by beta prime. Okay. For all I in Bn. Okay. So it solves this equation, and it's possible to solve explicitly this equation, and what we get is the following. The maximizer, I will denote it by R star, is explicitly given by R star at I is equal, and then again the signs have to be careful. So it's the green function in the box Bn evaluated at I and k minus the green function in the box Bn evaluated at I and 0, and this time it's over 4 beta prime. That's for all I in Bn. After Bn, it's 0 by assumptions, boundary condition. Okay. So that's the statement of lemma 819. I will prove this lemma in a few minutes. But first, I would like to check that it indeed implies the main theorem we are trying to prove now. So let's check that this is indeed the case. So assuming for the moment the validity of this lemma, let's conclude the proof. Okay, so first observation is that from standard random walk estimates and estimates on a green function, random walk estimates imply that the green function of the simple random walk on ZD actually, but here I'm interested in Z2, in a box Bn, evaluated at, what have I chosen? Say I and V, and I compare it with J and V. I want to see how much the green function, so one of the vertices is the same, it's V on both sides, But now I'm changing the first vertex. Here it's I, it's j, and I and j are neighbors. So I, j belong to the edges of my box. Okay? Then this quantity is always smaller than, what should I take so that it's nice? Say 2c. Okay. There exists some constant c, uniform. So there exists c. So such that uniformly in I and j and n and everything, we have this inequality. So this implies immediately that if you take the formula for Ri star, so let me check the sign again. Okay, fine. So if now I want to check this condition that I was assuming. So I was assuming in the computation that in the end I'm working with a function R which satisfies such an inequality. So let's check that indeed the function I'm choosing satisfies this inequality. So this will be bounded. So when I take R star I minus R star j, I and j are nearest neighbors. So I will get the difference of this green function with the green function where I replace I by j, and the difference of this green function with the green function where I replace I by j. Okay, so I get twice a bound of 2c, so I get a 4c as an error, 4c over 4 beta prime. Okay, so this will be bounded by c over beta prime, which is smaller than c over beta because beta prime is larger than beta. So indeed, I have an upper bound of this type, and therefore everything I'm doing is self-consistent. Okay, so that's the first observation. Okay. Then the second observation, we have to compute what I've not done in the lemma. I have to compute the value of d. So I want to choose for r in this upper bound here, I want to choose r is equal to r star. So I have to compute d of r star and see if I get something which is good enough as an upper bound. So let's compute d of r star. D of r star, so D is still on the board, it's this, so it's r star k minus r star 0. Minus beta prime times the Dirichlet energy, so let me, beta prime Dirichlet energy at r star, and so Dirichlet energy, you see it here. So let me see what, the only complicated piece here is the Dirichlet energy. Let's see what it's given by. So this by definition is sum over, it's 1/2 sum over all ij in the edge of the box. And we have a gradient r star ij square. And then what we do is we apply these discrete green identities we have used so many times already. So this will be, okay, so I hope the signs are correct, minus 1/2 sum over I in the n. And then I will get r star I, Laplacian r star I. And then I get the boundary term, which will be plus 1/2 sum over I in the n, j not in the n, I and j neighbors, and then I get r star j, gradient r star ij. And now things are pretty simple here because, let's say, can I use that? R star outside the box is 0 by construction, so this is equal to 0, so the whole term here is equal to 0. While here, what do I have? Well, the Laplacian of r star satisfies a simple equation. So Laplacian of r star, it's the solution, r star is solution of this equation. So Laplacian of r star is just given by indicator that I is 0 minus the indicator that I is k divided by beta prime. So that is the indicator that I is equal to 0 minus the indicator that I is equal to k divided by beta prime. Right? So what I get is that this is equal to minus 1/2. Then when I sum over I, the only terms which are not vanishing are when I is equal to 0, where I get just 1 over beta prime. So let me put the beta prime. Yes, it's correct. Beta prime here. And then, so I get, when I is equal to 0, I get R star of 0. And when I is equal to k, I get minus R star of k. Okay. So that's the expression I get. I just have to plug it here. So I get that this is equal to R star k minus R star 0. The beta prime simplifies with the beta prime which I have here. So what I'm just subtracting is, so if the signs are correct, so there is a minus here. So I'm subtracting 1/2 of what I already had. So what remains is 1/2 R star k minus R star 0. Okay, so that's what we get for d of R star. It's just given by this expression. And then, since we know R star, I can just now write explicitly d of R star. All this implies that d of R star is just 1/2. Now I go to this formula for R star. There is a 1 over 4 beta prime, so this gives me 1 over 8 beta prime, which multiplies. And then I have to take the difference of all these things, so I want R star k, so I get g bn of kk minus gbn of k0 plus gbn of 0, 0 minus gbn of 0k. Okay. If I just substitute here and there by the corresponding expression, I get that. And that's nice because this now, if I let bn go to infinity, because I want bn to go to z2, since what I'm really interested in is not this quantity, but the limit as n goes to infinity of this quantity, which gives me the expected value in the infinite volume Gibbs state, corresponding infinite volume Gibbs state. So I want to let bn go to z2. And when I do that, this quantity and this quantity, they are both converging to the same thing, which is denoted by a of k. That's as n goes to infinity. And this a of k is, so where a of k is what is called the potential kernel of the simple random walk on Z2, which is defined as follows. So a of k is just the sum over, say, m, probability starting at 0 that xm is equal to 0. So this would give you the green function 0 at 0, 0, but on Z2 this would diverge. It's infinity. Okay. So if you don't want it to diverge, you need to do something. And what you do is that you subtract this. If I written it this way, there are two ways to write it. I just want to check that it's the same. Okay, I don't know where I've done it. Okay, I don't know, but it will be correct in any case. So you can also change the role of the, sorry, it's not n, it's 0. You can interchange 0 in k. So this quantity is the potential kernel, and the asymptotic of this quantity is one of the classical results on random walk on ZD. You know very well how this behaves as k goes to infinity. One has that a of k is given, I think it's 2 over pi times the log. I don't know where I've put this stuff. 45, 46, 47, maybe it's here. Yes, it's here. Okay. So it's 2 over pi logarithm of the L2 norm of k plus something of order 1. Okay. Actually, you can be more precise in the assembly. We know what the constant is, and we know the next order terms, but this is enough for what we want to do. Okay. Now I claim that with this it's over. We've finished our proof. Well, let's just keep the line, the top line here, and let's check that this gives us what we want, and then we'll prove this lemma. Okay, so this is smaller than that, choosing r equal r star. Now I'm interested in the limit as n goes to infinity. I'm taking a sequence which converges to some Gibbs state, so this is well defined. And then this is bounded by the limit of this quantity, because this quantity really depends on the box Bn, okay, which is just what we have obtained now. So it's E minus this, so let's just check. So there is a 1 over 8 beta prime times this, so it will be 1 over 4 beta prime p, 1 over 4. I'm not completely happy with, oh, I get twice the term. Okay, so it's 2 beta prime p times log of k times some constant. Okay, the term of order 1, which I don't care much about. And this is indeed k to the minus 1 over 2 pi beta prime times the constant. Okay, so this gives us exactly the bound I claimed, which gives the algebraic decay of the two-point function at large beta. Remember, beta prime was 1 plus epsilon beta, so I can do that, for example. Okay, it's not the same epsilon. Okay. So that concludes the proof, conditionally on the lemma. So since it's almost 10, I suggest that we make the break now, and then I prove the lemma. We'll start in 15 minutes, and I prove the lemma. So the only thing that we still have to do is to prove this lemma 819, in which we determine the maximizer of the functional D. So proof of lemma 819. It will be very similar to what we did last time for the proof of the Mermin-Wagner theorem. So we start by looking for the critical point of the functional D. Critical points. Please. So we start with the critical point of D. So we want to solve this. So compute derivative with respect to S of D of R plus S times delta at S equals 0. And we want this to be equal to 0 for any function delta from dD to R, such that delta I is 0 outside the box. Okay. So just a matter of computation now. So let's compute the derivative of this quantity. Yeah, I'll try to do it here. EDS S times delta. So maybe let me write delta again somewhere so that we have it. Let me write it here. So delta of R, remember it was R of k minus R of 0 minus beta prime times, and let me write it, okay, epsilon of R, and this was 1/2 sum over all ij in B of R, say gradient R ij square. Just so that we have the definition in front of us. So we want to compute derivative of D, say at delta equal, at S equals 0. So what is this quantity? So I get Rk plus S delta k when I compute derivative, only delta k remains. Here only the delta 0. So this is delta k minus delta 0 minus beta prime. And then when we, that's the same computation essentially we did last time. When we compute the derivative of this evaluated at r plus s delta, what we get is the sum over all ij in B. And this will be gradient r ij, gradient delta ij. Let me just check the sign. Otherwise it will be a mess if I'm, no, it's okay. Okay, so that's what we get if you compute the derivative there. You get this expression. And now we want to do something, we want to check again for which r can we guarantee that this is equal to 0 for all values of delta. So again, gradient delta is not very nice. We'd like to have delta, so we integrate by parts. So this is delta k minus delta 0 minus beta, okay, plus beta prime now, making a summation by part, sum over all I in Bn, and then I will get delta I, Laplacian of r at I, that's the first term I get, the bulk term when I make the summation by part, and then the correction will be minus beta prime, sum over all I in Bn, j not in Bn, I and j neighbors, okay, of delta j gradient r ij. So this second term does not matter very much because by assumption delta is 0 outside the box, must not affect the boundary condition. So this is 0. So the whole term here is 0. So only the first term remains. So what we get is this. Okay. So if I rewrite that, this is equal to, and let's see what we have. So we have delta k, which multiplies 1 plus beta prime times the Laplacian. Okay. Beta prime Laplacian of r at k. Then we get delta 0, which multiplies 1. And there's a minus, so it will be minus beta prime Laplacian r at 0. And then for all the other terms, plus or minus, it's what? It's plus beta prime, sum over all ij in, no, sorry, all I in Bn minus 0k. I've already taken the two contributions coming from I equal k and I equal 0. And what remains is delta I Laplacian r. Okay? So now we want this to be 0 for all values of delta. So the only possibilities is that this must be equal to 0, this must be equal to 0, and this must be equal to 0. Okay? So what we get is that any critical point of the functional d has to satisfy the following set of equations. So we want to have delta r k must be equal to minus 1 over beta prime. Delta r 0 must be 1 over beta prime. And delta r at I is equal to 0 for all I in Bn minus 0k. Okay, so that's the set of conditions we have, which I can rewrite as in the statement of the lemma, saying that delta r at I is equal to the indicator that I is equal to 0 minus the indicator that I is equal to k divided by beta prime. Okay, so just the same thing. A summary of this can be written as that. Okay, so that's the first claim. I mean, any stationary point of this functional satisfies this equation. So now let's solve this equation and see that the solution is indeed what was given. So second step, Let's solve this equation. So the first observation, remember that we are only interested in functions r which are equal to 0 for all I not in the box. Okay? So this means that the Laplacian of r at I for all I in the box, the Laplacian of r at I is the same thing as the Laplacian Bn r at I. Remember that's the matrix where we restrict the Laplacian to the vertices in the box Bn, the one we used in the GFF. Okay? So this quantity and this quantity, they differ only by terms which involve the value of r outside the box, and it's 0 outside the box, so they are actually identical. So what we want really to solve, is this with delta replaced by delta Bn. So we want to solve delta Bn r at I is equal to 1 I equals 0 minus 1 I equal to k over beta prime. And now I've left a little bit of space here because so that's just a linear equation, right? We have some matrix applied to some vector is equal to some vector. It's very easy. It's enough to invert this matrix. I invert this matrix, I apply it on both sides, and then I've found the solution. And we have already inverted this matrix. Actually, we have not inverted the discrete Laplacian, but the discrete Laplacian divided by minus 1 over 2d. I mean, minus 1 over 2d, d is 2, here it's minus 1 over 4. Okay? This matrix, minus 1 over 4 times the Laplacian in the box, we have already inverted it, and we have seen that the inverse is just the green function in the box. So we have seen in the chapter on the GFF that minus 1 over 4, okay, of course, if I multiply by minus 1 over 4 here, I better do the same on this side. Okay. Then minus 1 over 4 Laplacian in Bn, inverse is just G Bn, just the matrix corresponding to the green function in Bn. Okay, that's what we have seen several weeks ago. Okay. So now I can just apply GBN on both sides, multiply, I act with this matrix on both sides of the equation. What I get is what? It's the sum over I in Bn, GBN, say Ji, then I get minus 1/4 Laplacian Bn Ji. Okay, let me do it like that, Ri. And then since this is the inverse of that, what I get is just Rj. That's empty. But this is also equal, using this identity here, to sum over, or say minus the sum over I in Bn, G Bn Ji, and then I take this guy, which is 1 I is equal to 0 minus 1 I is equal to k, all this divided by 4 beta prime. Okay, that's an identity, and then we compute this sum. This is equal to, well, there are only two terms which are non-zero. It's when I is equal to 0 and when I is equal to k. The positive one is when I is equal to k because of the two minuses. So let's start with this guy. So it's G Bn Jk minus G Bn this is J0 over 4 beta prime, which should be what I gave in the statement of the lemma, up to possible mistakes with the signs, but it should be correct. Okay, so we are almost done. The only thing we still have to check is that this solution, so that's the only critical point of the functional D. I have to check that it's indeed the maximum, and then I'm done. Okay. So last point, let's check that. So this function is what I will call R star. Right? Let's check that R star is the maximum, maximizer of D. And we proceed exactly as last week. So we look at d of r star plus delta, where delta is again a function of this type. I don't know where I wrote it, of this type, which is 0 outside the box. And I want to show that this is always smaller or equal d of r star. Okay. But this is not too bad, so that's r star k minus r star 0 plus delta k minus delta 0 minus beta prime and the Dirichlet energy of r star plus delta. So let's look a bit at the Dirichlet energy of r star plus delta. Let some space. So E of r star plus delta, we made the computation last week. It's E of r star plus E of delta plus a cross term, which is the sum over all ij in E, Bn, B, and gradient r star ij gradient delta ij. And then we do as usual, so this term, I rewrite it as minus the sum over I in Bn delta I Laplacian r star at I, plus a boundary term which will be 0, but let me just write it. So I in Bn, j not in Bn, I neighboring j, delta j, gradient r star ij. And again, delta j is 0 because outside the box it's equal to 0, so this is 0. Okay. The Laplacian of r star by assumption is the solution to, where is it, this equation, which is here. So well, I prefer the other version, this equation here. So r star, Laplacian of r star here is just the indicator that I is equal to 0 minus the indicator that I is equal to k divided by beta prime. Okay. So I get in the end that this is equal to E of r star plus E of delta. And then this factor, there are only two terms which remains. Because of the minus sign, I get delta k minus delta 0 over beta prime, hopefully with no mistakes, and we'll see. Okay, so now I'm ready to substitute. So when I substitute for this guy, I substitute this guy. What I get, let's first look at the E of r star. So E of r star minus beta prime E of r star plus r star k minus r star 0, this is just d of r star. So I reconstruct d of r star, which is what I want. And now I would like to construct something negative. Let's see, so we have plus delta k minus delta 0, which is here. And then we have minus beta prime E of delta, which is this guy. And then minus beta prime times that, so it will be minus beta prime disappears, there is a 1 over beta prime. So minus delta k minus delta 0. Okay. And obviously, if I've made no mistakes, this guy and this guy, they cancel. The Dirichlet energy is never negative. So this is smaller than d of r star, which concludes the proof. Okay. I have not said to whom this argument is due, so maybe I should say so. This proof is due to McBrien and Spencer. It's a null result. Very nice proof. Okay. So let me conclude this chapter with a few general remarks. Okay, so that's done. Some final remarks. So the first one is about possible extension of the result I've just proved. So this proof can be extended to any continuous interaction W. It's not completely obvious that you can do that because the first step of the proof is using the analyticity of the integrand. If W is only continuous, it's obviously not necessarily analytic. Okay, so there is something to do, but it's possible. You can also replace the nearest neighbor interaction with long-range interactions, essentially up to the optimal range for which the result is true. And to any, I did it for the XY model, but it can be extended. In principle, I suppose you are going to do it in exercise. You can extend it to any n greater or equal to 3. Okay. So that's the first comment. Okay, so you can extend it to vectors which take value in the sphere, not only the circles in the sphere or even higher dimensional spheres, but the result is bad in this case. So for n, the bound is expected, it's not known, but it's very strongly expected to be bad, in the sense that there is a conjecture which says that this quantity S0 Sk in any Gibbs state, whatever, this quantity should decay exponentially fast with k at all temperature. So the algebraic decay we have is not very good. So the real decay should be exponential, even for extremely large values of beta. Okay. So it's far from proven, but it's expected to be true. Physicists are convinced that this is true, at least. Let's say it like that. On the other hand, when n is equal to 2, the result is good. So for n equal to 2, so actually for the XY model, okay, let me do it like that. So for it's equal to 2, so Fröhlich and Spencer proved for the two-dimensional XY model that we have a similar lower bound, that S0 Sk is greater or equal to k to some power, say, minus d over beta. Probably they also have some prefactor, c of beta. Okay. A bound of this type, so it's not the right exponent, but it's the right algebraic type of decay. So they get this lower bound. This is what I did here was very easy, but this is very hard. So this I cannot explain in the course. But you can prove this lower bound, which shows that the result in dimension 2, so that's for all beta large, that the result is essentially optimal. It's the correct behavior, even if the exponent is not yet sharp. So it's interesting to observe the following consequence of what I've just said. So in particular, since the two-point function S0 Sk always decays exponentially fast when beta is small enough. Okay. This shows that the behavior of this two-point function changes when you go from high to low temperature. There is a change of behavior. It's decaying exponentially fast at high temperature. It's decaying algebraically fast at low temperature. So there is a phase transition associated to this change. That's the so-called Berezinski. There is 2I somewhere. Here, yes, Berezinski, Kosterlitz, Paules, phase transition. Which is a rather subtle phase transition which manifests itself in the change of decay of the two-point function, change of the rate of decay of the two-point function. In particular, for example, the free energy or the pressure, what I called the pressure earlier. So the pressure at this phase transition, it's extremely smooth. So it's infinitely differentiable, but it's not analytic. So it's a very, very smooth kind of non-analyticity that happens at this phase transition. It's not known, okay, but it's known by physicists, not known by us. But, okay. Not proven. Okay. So that's one thing I wanted to say. And also maybe another thing which we don't know how to prove is it's expected that in the XY model in dimension 2 there is a unique Gibbs state at all temperature. There is always a unique Gibbs state. So there is a phase transition, which is this phase transition, but at no place you will get two different Gibbs states. So it's a different type of phase transition from what we saw up to now in the course. Okay, so that was just one thing. Maybe a last remark is that what's the difference between n equal 2 and n greater or equal to 3? What is the relevant difference between these two cases which have as a result that at low temperature, when n equal to 2, you have algebraic decay, but when n is larger or equal to 3, you have exponential decay? What explains the difference? So it's not proved, so this will be physicist argument, but what the physicists claim is that it's the fact that, say, SO2 is abelian, but SON greater or equal to 3 is not. So it's really the fact that the group is abelian or not which should be responsible for the difference of behavior. Okay. But rigorously, it's not known. What is known rigorously is that the proof by Fröhlich and Spencer, which I said was done for the XY model, actually it works. It's pretty clear from the proof that it works for any model in which the symmetry group will be abelian. The same proof will work. So if the spin, instead of taking value in the circle, they take value in the torus, this would be fine. Okay? And so we know that when it's abelian, indeed, you have this behavior, but we have no idea why when it's not abelian, you have exponential decay at all temperature. It's completely open. Okay? And then the last thing which is natural to ask at this stage is, okay, we have seen various extensions, but one of the assumptions in the proof was that dimension was 2. So I said that in dimension 1, decay is always exponential. That's very easy, so that's not the question. But what happens in higher dimension? Is it possible to extend all these things to higher dimension? And the answer is no. In higher dimension, usually at large temperature, at low temperature, at large beta, you have long-range order, spontaneous magnetization. That's what we are going to investigate now in the probably last chapter of this course. On reflection positivity. So I don't know if you have already seen it, but in principle, it's on the lecture notes are on some very preliminary version of this chapter is on Camilo. So it's chapter 10. So reflection positivity. And application. So, how much time do I have? So I will start at least explaining what reflection positivity is about, and then so it's a type of, we'll work with some Gibbs measure which have some special type of symmetry under reflection, as the name indicates. And using this symmetry, it will be possible to establish two estimates one which is called the chessboard estimate and the other the infrared bound. And with these two estimates, we have powerful tools to study, to prove long-range order in models with continuous spins, okay? In particular, continuous symmetry. Okay, so let's start with what are reflection positive measures. Reflection positive measures. So in the whole chapter, contrary to what we did up to now, it will be much more natural, you will see why in a moment, to work on the torus instead of ZD, so d-dimensional torus. So I will work on the torus TDL, which is just Z over LZ. Okay, so d-dimensional discrete torus. Of size L, so it's really, since we have not did it now, up to now, so I'm really looking at the lattice on the torus. Okay. Maybe you did it in exercise at some point, so with periodic boundary conditions. It's the same thing. Okay. So that's what we are going to work with. And the transformation we'll be interested in are reflections, and we will distinguish between two types of reflections. Maybe you will see a third type in exercise, we'll see. In this case with Matan. So the two types of reflection we will be interested in are the following ones. Two types of reflections. The first one will be, let me maybe do it like that. So there will be reflection through vertices and reflection through edges. So the picture is as follows. I will draw the picture for a one-dimensional torus because it's easier to draw on the blackboard. Okay, but you have a nicer picture on in the notes. So let's say something like that. Okay, that's some one-dimensional torus, badly drawn, but okay, I hope you understand. And then what I will call the reflection through vertices is a reflection through a hyperplane, which is a symmetry hyperplane of the torus, so that if I reflect the torus through this hyperplane, here I'm dimension 1, so it's aligned. Okay. If I reflect the torus through this hyperplane, I get the torus again. Okay, it's invariant. And it's going through vertices of the torus. Okay. And the second one will be like that. Something like that. So it's still the same torus as before, I hope. And then I'm interested in a reflection of this style. Okay, it's going through the edges. It's again, the torus is invariant under the reflection. Okay. So we have a reflection theta, which interchanges the two halves of the torus. Okay, so that's T1 and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. 12? Okay. And then I will give a name to these two halves. So let's say this will be T. In general, this will be, okay, here it will be T112 plus, T112 minus of theta, depends on the reflection. The same here, T1 plus 12 plus of theta, T1 12 minus of theta. Okay. And the difference between the two cases, what makes these two cases different is the fact that, so in both cases I can write the torus, so let me write it in general now. This I can write it as the union of TL plus and TL minus. But in this case, the intersection between the two halves is not empty. It's given by the intersection between the plane of symmetry and the torus. So we have that T dl plus intersection T dl minus. Is not empty. While in this case, so we have the same thing, kind of thing. So TDL is TDL plus union TDL minus, but the intersection is empty. And this changes a little bit some estimates. But basically, they are treated in the same way. And both are useful in practice. So these are the reflections we are interested in. Then I can talk about reflection positive measures. So they are defined as follows. So at the moment, I want to be very general, but of course, in application, it will be much more concrete. So we start with what will play the role of the spin space. So it will be a single spin space. It will be some topological space S. Could be just plus minus 1, right? But in general, can be anything. Set of configuration will just be attaching an element of S to any vertex of the torus, d-dimensional torus, as usual. And I consider as usual the corresponding product sigma algebra on omega L. Okay, then let me take some reflection, theta, some reflection of TDL as above, one of these type of reflections. Then this reflection is defined, it's acting by definition on the vertices. It's sending vertices of the torus to vertices of the torus. It's sending this guy to this guy, and reciprocally. Okay. But I can, of course, extend this action to configuration, functions, and measures in the standard way. So that's what I want to do. So when I want to act on the configuration, omega, then the value at I of the configuration theta omega is just the value of the configuration omega at theta I. Then I can do the same for function. The action of, so I look at the function theta f, evaluated at the configuration omega. It will just be f of theta omega. And then for measures, say the expectation of f under a measure theta mu will just be the expectation of theta f under mu. Okay, so just the standard extension of the transformation to all the objects which we are interested in. In particular, theta at this level, if I look at it as a function acting on functions and configurations, at this level, I can see theta as a bijection. Theta can be seen bijection between two algebras of functions, which are just, I will denote them A plus minus of theta. And they are given by the function f omega L to R, which are such that the support of f is included in T d L plus or minus. So I'm looking at function which lives on the right part of on this right half of the torus and function which live on the left half of the torus. Okay? These are the two families of function a plus and a minus of theta. Okay? Then an easy exercise. It's easy, but we'll use it all the time. Let me just state. Exercise. Let me check. 10.1. Check that. For any function f and g which are in a plus of theta, for any lambda in R, we have the following. So theta square f is equal to f. Okay, that's not very difficult. Theta of lambda f is lambda theta of f. Theta of f plus g is theta of f plus theta of g. What else do I want? Theta of fg is theta of f, theta of g. Then theta of exponential of lambda f, or say exponential of f, whatever. This is e of theta. All very easy to do. These are manipulations I want to do all the time, so I want to state them. Okay, so now I can define what is a reflection positive measure. So definition. Then 2. So measure mu, probability measure, mu, probability measure on omega L, say with the usual product sigma algebra, is reflection positive with respect to some reflection theta if the following two conditions are satisfied. So the first one is that the expected value of f theta g under the measure mu that I'm considering is the same thing as the expectation value of g theta f under mu. And the second is that, and that's the important one, is that this is basically will always be true without anything to check, but this one is not trivial, is that f theta f is always non-negative. Okay, and these two things should be true for all f, g in a plus of theta. And then the set of all measures which are reflection positive with respect to theta, I will denote them by Rp of theta. So Rp of theta is the set of all mu, okay, all mu which are reflection positive with respect to theta. Good. Just a definition. So that's the core property we are going to use. And we'll see what it's good for. Maybe I will be able to give you an idea already now, before the end of the course today. So maybe first an exercise. I guess it's 10.3. Let me check. I'm skipping some things. Yes. Check that. Again, it's very easy, but 1 here, the first condition here, is actually equivalent. That's why I'm saying it's very cheap, this condition. It's essentially, it's equivalent to the fact that theta of mu is mu. So mu is invariant under reflection by theta. This will be very easy to satisfy in the kind of measures we are considering in this course, okay, on the torus. Okay, so that's an exercise. And then what's the point of this definition? So what I can reformulate the content of this definition as follows. So mu is reflection positive with respect to theta if and only if the bilinear form, so it's a bilinear form which goes from a plus of theta times a plus of theta to the real numbers, and it associates to a couple of functions f and g, which are both in a plus of theta. The expectation of f theta g under mu. Okay. Obviously, this is bilinear. Okay. This bilinear form, by these two assumptions, it is symmetric, and it is positive semi-definite. Okay. Is symmetric, that's by 1, and positive definite by 2. Okay. So why is it nice? Is that as soon as you have a bilinear form which has these two properties, you immediately get a Cauchy-Schwarz inequality. Okay. Let me state it, and then probably we'll end up with that today. State and prove. Okay, you have seen probably many times the proof of Cauchy-Schwarz. Let me do it just one more time. It's one line, so it's not a big deal. And this Cauchy-Schwarz inequality, which seems a very simple thing, it will be the basis on which we will construct everything in this chapter. So these two other estimates that I mentioned, the chessboard estimate and the infrared bound, they will be corollaries, in non-trivial corollaries, right, of this Cauchy-Schwarz inequality. So lemma 10(4). So let mu be reflection positive with respect to some reflection theta. Then we have that f theta g mu square is always smaller than f theta f mu g theta g. Okay, for any fg in a plus of theta. For Cauchy-Schwarz, this is the scalar product, if you want. Proof. It's the usual proof of Cauchy-Schwarz. So you just observe that f plus lambda g. Okay, let me do it this way. The expectation of f plus lambda g squared, while f plus lambda g squared is non-negative, so the expectation is non-negative, so this is certainly true, and then you expand the square. This is, I think I need a theta somewhere. Probably theta g would be, okay, no, okay, that was, of course, what I want is this, sorry. F plus lambda g. That's the scalar product we consider. So if I take this, then this is non-negative because mu, by assumption, is reflection positive, and f theta f is always non-negative. So that's what we have. And then we expand everything. And what we get is that the term in lambda square is given by g theta g mu lambda square. Then we get a term in lambda, which will be something like 2f theta g. Actually, there will be an f theta g and a g theta f, but by 1, f theta g and g theta f are equal. So, lambda. And then a constant term, which will be f theta f. Right? I'm just expanding the square and using properties 1 and 2. 1 here and 2 here. And then what I have here is a quadratic polynomial in lambda, and I'm asking for this polynomial. So it's a parabola. I'm asking for this parabola not to cross the x-axis, so it can touch it but not cross it. So this means that the discriminant has to be negative. Or non-positive. And if you write what the discriminant is, it's exactly f theta g mu square minus g theta g mu times f theta f mu. Okay, and you want this to be small equal to 0, which is exactly the statement of the lemma. Okay. So I will stop with that today, but this very simple Cauchy-Schwarz inequality, we will be able to bootstrap it. So what we will assume is that now the measure mu we will consider will be reflection positive, not through one particular reflection, but through all the possible reflections of the torus. And if you do that and you use Cauchy-Schwarz for all these possible reflections in a clever way, then you are able to derive much more powerful estimates than this very simple thing. Okay? That's what we will do next week. And we'll see very nice applications of these techniques.